The sun hadn't yet risen over Oahu when the sound of jackhammers cracked through the humid air. It wasn't even 0600, but the Navy Yard was already a roaring hive of men and machines. Sparks rained like fireworks from cutting torches. Welders in oil-streaked overalls crawled over torn steel, patching, hammering, swearing. The USS Yorktown, CVIV-05, lay wounded in dry dock number 1, battered, scorched, and bleeding from the Coral Sea. Her flight deck sagged where a 250-kilogram bomb had punched through and exploded below. Her hangar bay stank of fuel and scorched insulation. Below the waterline, hull plates had cracked from near-miss torpedoes. She looked like a floating graveyard. To many, she was finished. Lieutenant Commander John Milan stood amid the chaos, squinting through welding sparks, grease smudging his cheeks. He had walked her decks for years, but today, the Yorktown felt like a stranger. He stepped over a twisted ladder and stared down the yawning hole left by a bomb that had torn through 3 decks and exited out her side like a fist through paper. "This isn't a refit," Milan muttered to himself. "It's a resurrection." The clock was brutal. Admiral Chester Nimitz had walked the scorched flight deck just yesterday, and after a silent inspection turned to Milan and said one thing: "She sails in 72 hours. No later." It hadn't been a suggestion. Midway was only days away. Intelligence cracked from Japanese codes by the brilliant minds at Station Hypo had revealed something unthinkable. The Imperial Navy was preparing a trap. 4 fleet carriers, the pride of Japan, were steaming toward Midway. If they succeeded, Hawaii might be next. The U.S. had only 3 carriers left in the Pacific, and one of them was lying in this dock, coughing blood. The Japanese thought she was gone, and that gave Nimitz an opening. Overnight, 1,400 shipyard workers flooded dry dock number 1 like a wartime invasion. They brought everything: acetylene rigs, steel beams, floodlights, food trucks, even cots. Teams rotated in shifts around the clock. Men collapsed from exhaustion, napped next to bulkheads, then woke up and kept going. Nimitz had diverted every available resource. The battleship California, sitting wrecked since December 7th, was stripped for parts. Supply chains were cut. Red tape was burned. What wasn't available was invented. From the bridge, Commander Elias Bunker watched the yard crews tear apart the starboard catwalk. He had seen this ship take flight and nearly die at Coral Sea. 3 bombs, 1 nearly fatal. She'd limped 3,000 miles home, and now they were about to take her back out, wounded, into the jaws of the Japanese fleet. "Can she fight?" someone asked him. Bunker said nothing. He just stared at the crane, lowering a new radar mast into place. Below, Chief Machinist's mate Walter Smalls was elbow-deep in the number 3 boiler room, his face blackened with sweat and oil. The scalded metal inside still hissed from the Coral Sea fire. They had no replacement boiler. They would weld it shut, bypass it, and pray the others could take the strain. On the flight deck, knots of sailors laid down new steel plates over buckled wood. They weren't aligned perfectly, it didn't matter. She didn't need to be pretty. She just needed to launch planes. At one point, a young welder accidentally burned through a hydraulic line, flooding the lower hangar with fluid. No one yelled. No one stopped. 2 men plugged the leak with rags. A third kept welding. It was speed over precision, duct tape and desperation. But it was working. By the morning of May 28th, the Yorktown looked like she was rising from the dead. Her list had been corrected. Her elevators were functional. Her flight deck was sealed and sanded. Flight crews tested arrestor cables. Mechanics refueled aircraft. 2 dauntless dive bombers roared off the deck that afternoon in a test launch. Word spread across the Pacific Fleet: Yorktown will sail. On the morning of the 29th, just 48 hours after the repairs began, she was declared battle-capable. Not flawless, not whole, but ready. That evening, as the sun turned the Pacific gold, sailors stood on the deck of the newly raised carrier, eyes fixed on the horizon. They didn't know it yet, but within a week, they would face the might of the Japanese Kido, Butai Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu in one of the most decisive battles of the war. And because of what happened here in Pearl Harbor, because of every sleepless worker and jury-rigged repair, the Yorktown would be there. Her shadow, already thought buried beneath the Coral Sea, was steaming toward Midway. June 1942. The Pacific Ocean stretched endless and cold, blanketing thousands of square miles in silence. Somewhere beneath that blue canvas, two navies were racing toward a collision neither could afford to lose. The USS Yorktown had left Pearl Harbor the morning prior patched, bruised, but alive. As her screws churned the sea into white foam, sailors leaned over the rails and watched Hawaii vanish behind them. Ahead lay uncertainty, but something deeper burned beneath their boots. Revenge. For many aboard, Coral Sea had been a wake-up call. The war wasn't a distant echo anymore. It had a face, a smell, a scream. Bombs that detonated feet from their mess halls. Fires that clawed up through steel decks. Comrades buried at sea. And now, barely 2 weeks later, they were being asked to go again. Same ship, same dangers, less time to prepare. But no one complained. In the ready room, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, commander of Yorktown's air group, reviewed maps with his pilots. The walls vibrated from the hum of engines as mechanics tested aircraft on the flight deck above. McCluskey's finger traced a line northwest of Midway Atoll. They're coming from this vector. 4 carriers, maybe 5. If we catch them refueling or rearming, we hit them like hell. Beside him, Lieutenant Dick Best leaned against a bulkhead, quiet but focused. Best had already danced with death over the Coral Sea. He knew what was coming, and he knew their margin for error this time was even thinner. Yorktown's radar operators sat in dimly lit control rooms, fingers twitching near dials, ears straining for static. Any faint echo, any unnatural spike, could be a carrier group. Every hour at sea increased the tension. The ship was running at full battle tempo. Damage control teams drilled constantly. Pilots rehearsed launches and recoveries in quick succession. Fire crews inspected extinguishers, hoses, and smoke masks like surgeons preparing for trauma. Commander John Milan, now a legend below decks for his role in the 72-hour miracle at Pearl, stalked the engineering spaces with a stopwatch and clipboard. Every rattle in the turbine, every pressure dip, every suspicious sound was logged, measured, tested. There would be no margin for mechanical failure. The Pacific itself seemed to hold its breath. Across the task force, the mood was sharp and coiled. Fletcher's force was now part of a 3-carrier strike group, the hastily formed Task Force 17. Yorktown would operate alongside Enterprise and Hornet, both veterans from the Doolittle raid. This was the largest carrier strike force the U.S. had yet assembled, but still outnumbered. 4 American carriers against a Japanese force that outgunned, outmatched, and outexperienced them. The Kaido Butai was undefeated. The Japanese Navy's aviators were among the best in the world. Their aircraft were lethal, their tactics brutal. And yet, the Americans had one advantage. They knew the date, the objective, even the Japanese code word, AF. It was Midway. Thanks to the cryptographers at Station Hypo, men like Commander Joseph Rochefort Nimitz was already waiting at the trap Japan thought it had set. The brilliance of the deception was that Japan didn't know they'd been found out. The Yorktown would be the ghost in their mirror. On June 3rd, Yorktown's deck became a hive of activity before sunrise. Engines coughed to life. Deck crews in yellow shirts directed aircraft with glowing batons. The smell of fuel and salt hung heavy in the morning air. In the ready rooms, pilots donned flight gear with silent focus. Orders had come down. Midway was under threat. Enemy scout planes had been spotted. Bombers were likely en route. And somewhere out in the waves beyond the horizon, carriers. Japanese ones. Lieutenant Commander McCluskey stood on the deck beside his dauntless dive bomber. He turned to his radio man and said, "This is it. One pass, one chance." By mid-morning, Yorktown's air group launched into the sky, the sound of twin radial engines echoing as squadrons disappeared into the pale blue. Fletcher, calm behind the bridge's armored glass, kept his binoculars trained ahead. He was not a flamboyant man, not like Halsey, but he had the steel for command. and he knew the battle was coming soon. Very soon. Just after noon, spotters aboard Yorktown picked up signals. Distant, faint, not confirmed, but promising. Every man aboard knew what it meant. The hunt had begun. 3 days earlier, the Japanese were certain Yorktown was gone. Now, without fanfare, she was sailing toward them, a bruised giant, reborn in steel, silence, and speed. Her arrival would change the fate of the Pacific, and no one on the enemy's side knew she was coming. The sky over Midway was clear and blue that morning, a thin veil of serenity before the storm broke. Aboard the USS Yorktown, the tension had curdled into something electric. The hangar bays buzzed as crews prepped aircraft in silence, their faces drawn and pale under the red battle station's lights. On the bridge, Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher reviewed the latest reports. Midway's radar had picked up incoming enemy aircraft. A massive strike group, dozens of bombers, flanked by Zeros, all headed straight for the atoll. The Japanese had made their first move, but the Americans had moved faster. Thanks to intelligence from Station Hypo, Fletcher already knew that 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were somewhere to the northwest. His orders were clear: keep Yorktown hidden, launch a full strike, and cripple the enemy before they could strike back. Just before 0600, the decks of Enterprise and Hornet began to thunder with the takeoffs of their full air groups. Torpedo planes, dive bombers, and fighter escorts screamed into the sky in staggered formations. Their destination? The coordinates of the Japanese carriers. But Yorktown held back. Fletcher, cautious by nature, waited for confirmation before launching his own air group. It was a gamble and a tense one. Every minute that passed was another minute the enemy could get closer. Then it came. A scout plane from Enterprise spotted the Japanese fleet. 4 carriers, multiple escorts, maneuvering northeast of Midway. The trap was ready. Aboard Yorktown, the call went out: launch all strike aircraft. The deck became a machine of controlled chaos. Ground crews worked like a pit crew at Indianapolis. Fuel lines were unplugged, wings locked, bombs armed. Pilots climbed into cockpits, engines howled, and the deck shook with each departure. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, flying lead, led a wave of dauntless dive bombers into the sky. Alongside him, Lieutenant Dick Best once again took to the air, his stomach churning not from fear, but from the caustic oxygen he had inhaled during Coral Sea damage he never reported, but which would eventually cost him dearly. They climbed steadily, aiming for altitude and position. Below them, the Pacific was a mirror, broken only by the faint white wakes of distant ships. The Americans were now airborne. But they didn't know yet the Japanese had already launched their own strike. Midway Island was under fire. Bombs fell like rain on the sand and runways. Hangars exploded in gouts of smoke. But the defenders held. Marine gunners blazed away at low-flying Zeros. Some of the planes never made it back. It was during this crucial window, when the Japanese were still rearming and refueling their aircraft for a second strike, that fate turned. At around 1020 hours, the first American dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown reached the enemy fleet. After nearly missing the formation, McCluskey spotted a lone Japanese destroyer speeding north, likely rejoining the fleet after chasing a submarine. He followed its path, and there they were. 3 of the 4 carriers, decks exposed, aircraft being fueled, bombs strewn about. They were vulnerable in a way they almost never were. The American pilots broke formation and peeled into their dives. Dick Best and his wingmen screamed down toward Akagi and Kaga, their dauntless dive bombers howling as gravity seized them. Wind roared in their ears. Tracers lit up the sky. Anti-aircraft flak erupted around them. But the targets were right there, massive, flat, and defenseless. The first bombs hit Kaga. The second wave pummeled Soryu. Then Akagi took a direct hit from Best himself, a single 1,000-pound bomb that punched through her flight deck and detonated in the hangar bay among fully armed planes. Within minutes, the pride of the Japanese fleet was in flames. 3 carriers crippled. 1 remained. And that's when the enemy struck back. While American pilots returned to their carriers or ditched into the sea, Hiryu, the last operational Japanese carrier, launched a full strike aimed at Yorktown. At 1,101 hours, Yorktown's radar picked up the inbound formation. Battle station sounded. Crews scrambled into fire suits. Damage control teams deployed. Anti-aircraft gunners checked their sights. On the deck, planes from the earlier launch were hurriedly recovered and rolled below. The first wave of Japanese bombers came in low. Zeros strafed the deck as dive bombers spiraled down in coordinated precision. Gunners aboard Yorktown unleashed a storm of lead 5-inch flak bursts. Penkias deschimt kaliber tracers, continuous fire. But some got through. 2 bombs smashed into Yorktown's flight deck. One exploded just off the starboard side of the island, knocking out communications and starting a fire. The other punched through near the forward elevator and detonated deep inside the ship. Smoke poured from the hangar bay. Power failed. The ship listed. But Yorktown didn't. Within minutes, damage control parties rehearsed to exhaustion were containing the fires, counter-flooding compartments, restoring partial power. The ship slowly righted herself. Gunners stayed at their posts. Engineers brought the boilers back online. From the air, the Japanese believed they'd sunk her. From the deck, Yorktown's crew was already preparing for the next strike. She had come back from Coral Sea. And now, with smoke trailing from her deck, she was refusing to sink again. The fight for Midway was far from over. Smoke still curled from the forward elevator, while as sailors scrambled across Yorktown's deck, dragging hoses, sealing hatches, shouting through scorched masks. Below the flight deck, damage control teams sloshed through knee-deep water and choking heat. They patched holes with steel plates and canvas. They shored up bulkheads with wooden beams. Some worked shirtless in the dark, lit only by flickering battle lanterns, the air thick with the stink of oil and cordite. And yet, somehow, the Yorktown stayed afloat. Even more, she was fighting. By 12:30 hours, the ship had stabilized. Her fires were under control. Power was partially restored. Radar systems were back online. And by some miracle of grit and coordination, her flight deck was clear enough to recover aircraft. It was a victory, but a fragile one. On the bridge, Admiral Fletcher weighed the damage. The Japanese strike had been brutal. But Yorktown was still in the fight, and her crews had proven that she could take a beating and keep going. Fletcher gave the nod. Recover our aircraft, prep for counterstrike. At that same moment, the Japanese carrier Hairu launched her second wave. The first strike hadn't sunk the Yorktown. That couldn't be allowed to stand. 16 bombers escorted by Zeros streaked across the Pacific, hugging the cloud deck. They came in fast, lower this time, hoping to avoid radar. Yorktown's fighters were still circling, low on fuel, recovering. Gunners below saw glints in the sky dots on the horizon that grew into death. General quarters sounded again. It hadn't even been 2 hours since the last attack. This time, the enemy came from starboard. The first bomb hit forward of the island, blasting a hole in the deck and knocking out the forward boilers. The second penetrated near the stack, exploding deep within the engineering spaces. Compartments flooded rapidly. Lights went out. Communications fell silent. Chief Machinist's mate Walter Smalls, already exhausted from the morning assault, was in the number 2 engine room when the second bomb hit. He was thrown across the compartment but crawled back toward the gauges. Pressure was falling. The boilers were dying. He grabbed the nearest wrench and shouted for backup, but the backup wasn't coming. Too many had already gone silent. Above him, the flight deck began to sag. Captain Elliot Buckmaster, commanding Yorktown from the bridge, gave the order no one wanted to hear: abandon ship. It was 1,425 hours. But even in retreat, Yorktown did not go quietly. Lifeboats were lowered. Sailors helped wounded men into rafts. Officers gave up their spots to younger men. The evacuation was fast, orderly, painful. And yet, even as smoke poured from her hull, Yorktown still floated. She didn't roll over. She didn't list. She simply drifted, silent and wounded, like a warhorse refusing to fall. Destroyers circled to pick up survivors. USS Hammond, a Sims-class destroyer, moved in to assist with firefighting and provide power. Her crew tied up beside the larger carrier and sent damage control teams aboard. But Hiryu wasn't done yet. From the horizon, A final group of torpedo bombers raced in low over the waves. These were the last desperate throws from a carrier already doomed a spiteful final blow. Lookouts on Hammond shouted warnings. Fish in the water starboard side. 2 torpedoes struck Yorktown. The impact was devastating. Explosions rocked her amidships. Bulkheads tore. Compartments filled instantly. The shockwave tore through Hammond as well. One of the destroyer's depth charges, shaken loose, detonated beneath her. She broke in half and sank in under 4 minutes, taking 80 of her crew with her. Yorktown, wounded beyond saving, began to list heavily, slowly, reluctantly, as if she too didn't want to go. And then she stopped. She didn't sink. For the rest of June 4th and into the early morning of June 5th, the crippled carrier remained afloat. Tugs were dispatched. Salvage crews made plans. There was still hope, however, slim, that she could be towed back to Pearl Harbor, maybe patched again, maybe saved. But the sea had other plans. By dawn on June 7th, Yorktown finally rolled over. With a groan of torn steel and a blast of escaping air, she slipped beneath the surface. She had fought 2 battles in 2 weeks. She had survived 2 full aerial assaults in a single day. She had bought the time and space for American pilots to finish the job and win Midway. She didn't die in vain. By the time Yorktown disappeared beneath the waves, Hiryu, the last Japanese carrier, had already been found, bombed, and burning. The Battle of Midway was over. The tide of the Pacific had turned. The smoke still curled over Midway as the last enemy aircraft vanished beyond the clouds. The wreckage of war floated silently in the Pacific, charred fuel tanks, broken wings, empty rafts, the ocean swallowing evidence of one of the most pivotal battles in naval history. But for the Japanese high command, the picture was still distorted. They believed Yorktown had been sunk early in the day twice. In fact, their pilots, returning to Hiryu, confidently reported the carrier burning, listing, dead in the water. One aviator even sketched what he thought was her silhouette disappearing beneath the waves. Commanders believed they had crippled America's last resistance at sea. The remaining American carriers must now be fleeing. But they didn't know. They didn't know the ship they thought they had sunk at Coral Sea Yorktown had risen from the dead just 3 days prior. They didn't know she had launched a full air group that helped destroy Soryu and Kaga in mere minutes. They didn't know the very ship they believed, still rusting at the bottom of the Coral Sea, had absorbed 2 bomb hits, 2 torpedoes, and still refused to go down immediately. That's why the Japanese strategy collapsed. At every step of the Midway operation, they had overestimated their own invincibility and underestimated American resilience. They had no idea that the Yorktown they had written off, the one patched together with scavenged parts, jury-rigged pipes, and welded steel, had just tipped the balance of the war. American dive bombers, many of them launched from her decks, had dropped their payloads into open hangars packed with torpedoes and fully fueled planes. They'd turned the pride of the Imperial Navy into floating infernos. Japanese deck crews had no time to clear bombs. Planes exploded where they Saturday. Fire suppression systems were overwhelmed. Sailors jumped overboard, many never seen again. The Japanese fleet was paralyzed by shock. In under 6 minutes, 3 of their 4 fleet carriers had been reduced to burning wrecks. Their loss wasn't just military. It was cultural, symbolic, almost spiritual. These were the same carriers that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor just 6 months before. The same ships that had terrorized the Pacific. Now, they burned alone on the open sea, and behind the curtain of that disaster stood the ghost of Yorktown. In Washington, military analysts would later struggle to believe it. One carrier rushed out of dry dock in 72 hours had not only absorbed the brunt of 2 enemy strikes, but had also played a decisive role in sinking 3 enemy carriers. The math didn't add up, but the battle had never been about numbers alone. It had been about speed, grit, intelligence, willpower. On June 8th, in a quiet corner of Pearl Harbor, Admiral Nimitz received the final confirmation. Yorktown was gone. The men who had fought on her had been largely rescued. Her captain, Elliot Buckmaster, survived. But she would never return. Nimitz, a man known for his calm demeanor, said little. But he later described Yorktown's loss not just as a blow, but as a sacrifice. One that had helped stop the bleeding in the Pacific. One that had ensured the United States was no longer reacting to Japan, but advancing. Back in the Pacific, aboard Enterprise, pilots gathered in the ready room, exhausted and silent. Many hadn't slept in 36 hours. Some hadn't eaten in 2 days. Their uniforms were stained with sweat, oil, and blood. But they were still standing. Lieutenant Dick Best sat slumped against the wall, his oxygen-scorched lungs aching. He didn't know yet that his bomb had sealed Akagi's fate, the flagship of the Japanese fleet. He didn't know it would be his last mission. He would be grounded after Midway by tuberculosis, ending his combat career just days after his most critical flight. Others like him, including Wade McCluskey, would return to find their names etched into history. But at the time, they felt no triumph, only fatigue. Victory at Midway hadn't felt like glory. It had felt like survival, and yet, the results were undeniable. 4 Japanese fleet carriers gone. Thousands of trained pilots, deck crew, and engineers, irreplaceable, lost to the depths. Japan's carrier strength, the core of its naval power, had been gutted. America had lost Yorktown, but Japan had lost the war's initiative. It would take years, thousands more lives, hundreds of battles to end the conflict in the Pacific. But the tide had shifted. Yorktown had given her last breath to make it happen. And somewhere, deep beneath the waves, she still rests, steel twisted, paint peeled, but legacy unbroken. Long after the last dive bomber disappeared over the horizon and the guns fell silent, the Pacific Ocean continued to carry the echoes of Midway. Beneath the waves, steel graveyards stretched across the ocean floor. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, and Yorktown. Giants, once thunderous with life, now hushed monuments to a moment that changed the course of history. But back on the American home front, something extraordinary was unfolding. News from Midway was slow to surface, censored, delayed, incomplete, but the rumors outpaced official reports. Families gathered around radios, hanging on every syllable. Newspapers hinted at a major victory, and slowly, the story emerged. 4 Japanese carriers had been sunk. American losses were light, though the price would eventually become clear. Yet what captured the imagination most wasn't just the triumph, it was the resurrection. Word of Yorktown's miraculous return from Coral Sea spread like wildfire through the fleet. Sailors told the tale with reverence, as if recounting legend. A ship struck by bombs, patched in 3 days, and thrown into one of the most critical battles of the war, only to be struck again, and still refuse to die. She became more than steel. She became symbol. To the men who served aboard her, Yorktown wasn't just a vessel. She was a fighter, a protector, a floating city that had saved them once at Coral Sea and again at Midway. They remembered her not by hull numbers or tonnage, but by how she trembled when planes launched from her deck, how her bulkheads groaned under strain, how her crew moved through fire and shrapnel without breaking stride. Seaman First Class Jack Crumley, who survived both battles, later wrote in his journal, "We thought we left her in the grave. We thought Coral Sea took her. But when we saw her steaming beside us at Midway, patched up, battle-worn, proud, we knew. We weren't just fighting with ships. We were fighting with ghosts who refused to rest." That ghost haunted the Japanese, too, not through superstition, but through disbelief. For weeks after Midway, enemy reports struggled to reconcile how Yorktown had reappeared. Their intelligence had confidently recorded her destruction. Recon photos after Coral Sea showed oil slicks and smoke columns. They had counted her out. And yet, there she was, delivering fatal blows to the Kido Butai, the heart of Japan's carrier fleet. It revealed something deeper, a flaw in the Japanese war machine: underestimation. They had assumed the Americans would need weeks, if not months, to repair a damaged carrier. They believed the Pacific Fleet was still reeling from Pearl Harbor. What they didn't understand was that America's true power wasn't just in its ships, but in its urgency, its industry, and its refusal to quit. The Yorktown dry dock miracle wasn't a one-time feat. It became a pattern. Over the next year, American shipyards would crank out carriers faster than Japan could destroy them. Escort carriers, light carriers, Fleet carriers. The Essex class would arrive in waves. And in every one, Yorktown's DNA lingered a blueprint for speed, grit, and determination. She had set the standard. Back at Pearl Harbor, a new carrier would soon take the name Yorktown C.V. Watton as a tribute. Her christening carried weight beyond the traditional bottle of champagne. It was a promise, we remember. The name would not die with CVFU-5. The fight would go on. Sailors who had served aboard the original Yorktown were transferred to her successor. Some couldn't bear the sound of flight ops on the new deck. Others found solace in it, a rhythmic heartbeat, familiar and strong. Together, they carried forward not just a name, but a legacy. In war, ships are often seen as tools, weapons, numbers on maps. But to those who sailed her, Yorktown was something more. She was the embodiment of every late-night drill, every patched hull plate, every rescue in open water. She represented the will to fight even when the odds said surrender. She was every rivet driven in the dark by a shipyard worker with blistered hands. Every wrench turned with trembling fingers in a smoke-filled boiler room. Every pilot who climbed into a cockpit knowing they might not return. She was, in every sense of the word, American. And though she sank beneath the sea, Yorktown never truly left the war. Her memory flew with every dive bomber that rose from Enterprise or Hornet. Her defiance echoed in every repair crew that refused to quit. Her spirit lived on in every sailor who chose duty over fear. The Pacific was vast, and the war far from over. But after Midway, the tide had shifted not just tactically, but spiritually. Because once, a carrier that wasn't supposed to exist showed up when it mattered most. Long after Yorktown disappeared beneath the waves, her ghost lived on not in superstition, but in the hands and hearts of the men who had walked her decks, fought beside her walls, and kept her alive when every odds said she should have died. For them, she wasn't a warship. She was home. A battered, blistered fortress that had carried them across hell. And what made Yorktown extraordinary wasn't just armor plating or flight deck length. It was the men who made her breathe. Men like Chief Machinist's mate Walter Smalls, who'd held the line in the boiler room as steam burst from cracked valves, burning through his uniform and scalding his chest. He'd refused to leave, sealing a ruptured steam pipe with nothing but a wrench and a soaked fire blanket until backup arrived. When asked later why he didn't run, his answer was simple. If the engines go, she goes. And she wasn't ready to go. Or Ensign Harold Farnsworth, a radar operator barely 22, who stayed at his console during the second wave of the attack. As the ship shook from the torpedo strike, smoke pouring through the ventilation, he kept calling out enemy positions until the line went dead. He was found unconscious, dragged out with bleeding ears, but alive. His data helped direct the final bursts of anti-aircraft fire that kept Yorktown's gunners zeroed in. And there was Boatswain's Mate First Class Leo Kirkland, who manned a .50 caliber mount during both attacks. He fired until his barrel overheated, then grabbed a fire extinguisher to cool it down and fired again. When the ship began to list, he stayed on station until ordered off the deck. By then, his hands were burned to the bone. These weren't mythical figures from some grand epic. They were ordinary Americans from Nebraska farms, Detroit machine shops, New York shipping yards. Most had never seen a war before Coral Sea. And yet, they rose. They didn't just fight the enemy, they fought steel failure, water pressure, rising flames, shrapnel, blood loss, and the sickening churn of knowing that if they failed, no one was coming to save them. Every compartment on Yorktown had stories like these. The gunnery crews who reloaded blind through smoke. The cooks who became stretcher bearers. The signalmen who kept their lamps flashing even as bomb blasts shattered windows. One petty officer tied a tourniquet around his own leg, and then returned to help load a torpedo bomber. This wasn't heroism in the way movies depict it. It was messier, louder, raw. Down in the ship's sickbay, pharmacist's mate Charles Renshaw set up triage on a makeshift table as wounded poured in. With no morphine left, he used pressure, prayer, and whiskey. He lost men. He saved more. And when the order came to abandon ship, he helped carry 5 sailors who couldn't walk. Even in retreat, Yorktown didn't dissolve into panic. Officers stayed until the last lifeboat. Men jumped into oil-streaked waters only after making sure the flight deck was clear. The final bugler aboard Seaman Edward Mills stood on the hangar deck and sounded "abandoned ship" in 3 long notes. He held it to the end. When survivors were pulled aboard destroyers like Hammond, some wept. Others stared into the distance, quiet, shaken, salty-skinned and sunburned. They carried scars physical and invisible, but they also carried something else. The burden of having served aboard a ship that, by all logic, should never have made it to Midway, and did. After the war, they would return home to scattered lives. Some became teachers, mechanics, factory foremen. Others went back to sea. A few never talked about Yorktown again. But those who did spoke of her like an old friend. Not perfect, not invincible, just defiant. Reunions were held decades later, gray-haired men in worn Navy caps, gathering around plaques and models of CV-5. They'd point at grainy photos and say, "That's where I was when the bomb hit." Or, "That's the boiler I shut down." They'd talk about the ship like she was still out there, just beyond the horizon. In one 1982 interview, former aviation electrician's mate Sam Lasky was asked what Yorktown meant to him. He didn't hesitate. "She taught us that steel can break, but people don't have to." That was the legacy. Not just the victory at Midway, not just the destruction of the Japanese carrier fleet, but the reminder that ordinary men, when pushed to the edge, can hold the line. That courage isn't about never being afraid, it's about moving anyway, even when the deck is burning beneath your boots. Yorktown didn't die when she sank. She lived on in every man who carried her memory forward, not in medals or monuments, but in how they walked, how they worked, how they remembered. She had lasted just 5 years from keel to grave, but in those 5 years, she helped stop an empire. In the great sweep of World War II, entire continents shifted, cities fell, and millions marched. But for 3 days in June 1942, June 4th, 5th, and 6th, the fate of the Pacific hung on a knife's edge, balanced between chaos and courage, between destruction and survival. At the center of that narrow fulcrum stood a battered ship, stitched together in desperation, the USS Yorktown. Those 72 hours changed everything. Historians often point to the grand strategies: Japan's push eastward, the planned occupation of Midway, the larger goal of forcing a peace favorable to the empire. And yet none of it accounted for what happened when American codebreakers cracked the Japanese operation, when Nimitz made the gamble to commit every carrier he had left, or when Yorktown, battered and barely seaworthy, showed up to a fight she wasn't expected to survive, and did more than just survive. Her presence at Midway didn't just bolster American numbers, it confused the Japanese, it fractured their assumptions. Their pilots returned from attack runs convinced they'd sunk 2 different American carriers, unaware they'd hit the same ship twice. That misjudgment fed chaos into Japanese decision-making. It forced Hiryu to launch its final strike wave under duress, rushed, without proper escort, exposing its bombers to deadly interception. That single ship floating, wounded, refusing to die, had disrupted the entire enemy battle plan. When Admiral Yamamoto learned of the loss of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, the air was ripped from the lungs of the Imperial Navy. And when Hiryu, their last operational carrier, went up in flames, reality set in. The tide had turned. The United States Navy, considered an underdog just 6 months prior, had gone toe-to-toe with the most powerful carrier strike force in history and emerged victorious. Because of Yorktown. And yet, her greatest contribution wasn't just in firepower, it was time. Yorktown bought hours. Hours that allowed American dive bombers to locate Japanese carriers before they launched a second strike. Hours that gave Nimitz the edge he needed. Hours that saved Enterprise and Hornet from full-scale attacks. The miracle wasn't just that she sailed to Midway. It was that she absorbed 2 separate, concentrated attacks and still functioned long enough to contribute fully, decisively to victory. Even as her decks buckled and her boilers hissed in pain, she bought time. And in war, time is everything. In the aftermath, the true scale of the victory slowly came into focus. The Japanese Navy had lost 4 of its 6 frontline fleet carriers, a blow from which it would never fully recover. Their elite naval aviators, the best in the world at the time, perished in shocking numbers. Replacing ships was hard. Replacing skilled crews was impossible. America, by contrast, had survived with a single carrier lost and a fraction of the casualties. Yorktown's sacrifice had preserved not just the other carriers, but the entire momentum of the war in the Pacific. From that point forward, the initiative shifted. Japan would never again mount a strategic offensive across the Pacific. They would retreat, dig in, and fight a war of attrition they were not prepared to win. And back home, the story of Yorktown spread. It became legend in Navy yards and boot camps. Young sailors learned the name not from textbooks, but from stories told between bunks about the carrier that came back from the dead, the engineers who worked around the clock in Pearl Harbor to make her seaworthy, the pilots who took off from her scorched deck to strike back, and the final moment when she refused to sink until every man was off. She wasn't the biggest carrier. She wasn't the fastest. She wasn't even the most modern. But she was enough. In those 72 hours, Yorktown stood between defeat and dominance. And the war shifted with her. To this day, Naval War College instructors still cite the Battle of Midway as a masterclass in intelligence, leadership, and timing, and Yorktown is central in every case study. Not because she was perfect, but because she was resilient. She was the wounded fighter who answered the bell one more time, threw everything she had, and left the ring only after making sure the enemy didn't get back up. 3 days. That's all she had. But in those 3 days, she helped turn the greatest war in human history. The cost of Midway wasn't measured only in carriers and aircraft. It was etched into the bodies and minds of the men who fought it. For all the strategy, code-breaking, and maneuvering, Midway had come down to human beings tired, terrified, and relentless, standing between catastrophe and a future worth fighting for. Among the survivors pulled from the oil-streaked waters near Yorktown was signalman third-class Raymond Holt. He'd manned his post through both air attacks, relaying flag signals to escorting destroyers until the carrier's listing made communication impossible. When the abandoned ship order came, he helped 3 wounded shipmates into a life raft before jumping himself. Floating in the Pacific, clinging to a rope soaked in diesel, he looked back at the Yorktown black smoke still rising from her funnel, her great hull stubbornly above water, and whispered, "She's not going to go easy." She didn't. Even after absorbing bomb and torpedo hits, even with her power gone and fires tearing through her decks, Yorktown stayed afloat for nearly 3 full days. It took the last desperate wave from Hiryu and a pair of torpedoes to finally bring her down. And even then, she didn't sink immediately. She resisted, held on. It was as if she knew she wasn't done yet. But for all the grit and engineering, Yorktown couldn't escape the truth of war. Even victory demands sacrifice. The destroyer, USS Hammond, tied up alongside to assist with damage control, was ripped apart by one of the torpedoes intended for Yorktown. She went down in minutes. 84 of her crew died. Some were killed in the initial blast. Others went down with the ship. Many more were dragged under by the violent suction as she slipped beneath the sea. There was no time for goodbyes. No time to mourn. The survivors from both ships clung to floating debris, coughing up salt water and oil, trying not to look at the faces beside them. It was survival, pure and stripped to the bone. But these losses, as raw and brutal as they were not in vain. For every man lost aboard Yorktown and Hammond, hundreds were saved by what they achieved. Their fight held the line. Their resistance bought the precious hours needed to break the back of Japanese naval power. Still, the grief was real and lasting. Back in the States, families received telegrams, those terse gray notices stamped with Navy Department headers. "We regret to inform you." Some widows got little more than a name and a battle date. Sons who'd gone to sea full of pride and promise were now folded into history, their final resting places marked only by waves. Yet even in loss, there was pride. The Battle of Midway wasn't just a tactical turning point, it was a psychological one. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, Americans believed they could win. Not just hold on, not just fight bravely, win. The myth of Japanese naval invincibility had cracked open, and through that crack, a new spirit emerged. Yorktown was at the center of that shift. Her death wasn't a defeat. It was a message. You can hit us, you can wound us, but we will return, faster than you expect, stronger than you fear. And when we do, we will not fight alone. That spirit spread far beyond the Pacific. In the factories of Detroit and Seattle, welders and riveters worked with renewed purpose, building the next class of carriers, Essex-class giants that would soon fill the ocean. On bases from Norfolk to San Diego, young recruits drilled longer, harder, whispering Yorktown's name like a legend passed through generations. Even the brass noticed. Fleet commanders began to reframe their doctrine, seeing not just in numbers but in people the fire marshals who held the line below decks, the green pilots who made the impossible dive, the engineers who refused to leave their posts. They weren't just parts of a machine. They were the reason the machine worked. And as for the enemy, they understood it too, even if they never said it aloud. They had believed the United States would break under pressure, that the shock of Pearl Harbor, the setbacks in the Philippines, and the losses at sea would force a negotiated peace. But at Midway, they discovered something else. Even when the U.S. Navy was down, it wasn't out. Even when a carrier was supposed to be dead, it showed up. And even when its deck was burning, its guns still fired. Yorktown proved that America could take the hit and hit back harder. Her wreck now lies more than 16,000 feet beneath the Pacific, found decades later by a deep-sea expedition. She rests silently in the darkness, her hull surprisingly intact, her gun mount still in place, her history preserved by pressure and cold. No crew remains aboard, but none are forgotten. Every steel beam is a story, every rivet, a heartbeat, every deck, a memory. The ocean keeps its secrets, but some are too loud to forget. More than 80 years after the Battle of Midway, Yorktown remains not only a sunken relic of steel and rivets, but a living symbol carried forward in memory, tradition, and the very shape of American naval power. Her story of comeback, sacrifice, and sheer human will echoes through generations of sailors, shipbuilders, historians, and families whose lives were forever marked by those 3 days in June. When divers and sonar teams finally located her in 1998, 16,650 feet down, resting upright on the seabed, they were stunned by her condition. Unlike so many wrecks lost to time and current, Yorktown remained remarkably intact. Her gun turrets were still in place. Her hull barely collapsed. Even her name was still visible in block letters beneath decades of sediment. It was as if she was waiting not to be raised, but to be remembered. But long before anyone found her physical resting place, Yorktown had already reappeared not in the form of a ship, but in the blood and bones of a new navy. Her spirit was carved into the decks of USS Yorktown, CV-10, the Essex-class carrier that took her name less than a year after Midway. Larger, faster, and better armed, CV-10 would go on to fight through the Pacific with honor in the Marshalls, the Philippines, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. But to the men who served aboard her, she wasn't just a new warship, she was a continuation. They called her the Fighting Lady. And they knew exactly whose legacy they carried. That legacy shaped not just one ship, but an entire doctrine. Yorktown's fight at Coral Sea and Midway taught the U.S. Navy a lesson it would never forget. That air power at sea was not just the future, it was the heart of modern warfare. Battleships, once the center of every fleet, had taken a back seat. It was the carrier, now flexible, fast, and far-reaching, that would decide wars. And so the U.S. Navy changed. New classes of carriers poured from shipyards Essex, Midway, and eventually Nimitz. Training intensified. Pilots were drilled in coordinated strike packages. Engineering teams were built for speed repairs and damage control. Radar operators, gunners, deck crews, all were trained with one truth in mind. Midway had been won not just by who had more planes, but by who recovered faster, who adapted, who refused to sink. Yorktown's legacy wasn't just in the pages of textbooks. It lived in the way sailors responded to fire, how commanders made decisions under pressure, how engineers looked at a crippled hull and saw not failure, but time. Time to fix it, time to launch, time to fight again. And it lived on shore, too. In the towns where sailors returned, in the families who carried the names of men who never made it home, Yorktown was a quiet refrain, a reminder that even in the darkest chapters, sacrifice could carve out a turning point. She became a symbol not just of war, but of perseverance. In museums, her story is told in flight decks reconstructed piece by piece. In model kits, her silhouette still sits on desks of those who never served but were inspired. In movies and books, she reappears a ghost with smoke trailing from her stack, pushing forward against all odds. And in Annapolis, at the U.S. Naval Academy, midshipmen still study her battle reports, still trace the flight paths of her SBD dauntless squadrons, still ask how a wounded ship managed to hold the line long enough for victory. Because Yorktown is not just a story of a ship, she is a story of how America fights. With urgency, with resolve, with belief that sometimes 72 hours can change history. She taught that war isn't always won by the most polished force, but by the one that stands back up after being hit, pulls itself together with grit and grease, and sails into fire again. That's what she did. That's why she mattered. That's why she endures. Beneath thousands of feet of water, Yorktown rests quietly now, her watch complete. No more bombs, no more alarms, no more flames clawing up her decks. Just silence and the endless rhythm of the Pacific rolling above. But in every carrier that sails today, in every patch stitched with her name, in every sailor who fights to save his ship when the odds look grim, Yorktown lives.